I've been with Jim for 5 years now, and I've always been very clear about what I need in a relationship. From the very beginning, I told him that I wasn't ready to live together, that I needed my own space, my independence. Some women might compromise on things like that, but I've never been the type to settle or change who I am just to make a man comfortable. When we first started dating, he was 42 and I was 41. Both of us old enough to know what we wanted, and what I wanted was a relationship on my terms. The arrangement we settled into worked perfectly for me. I'd spend 3 weeks every month visiting my parents who live about 300 kilometers away, then come back for 2 or 3 weeks. Jim accepted this without question, which honestly surprised me, because most men would have thrown some kind of tantrum about their girlfriend being away that much. But Jim's always been passive like that, just going along with whatever I decide. Sometimes I think that's what attracted me to him initially. He wasn't trying to control me or change my lifestyle like other guys had. My parents' house has always been my sanctuary. It's where I can decompress from work stress and just be myself without having to perform the girlfriend role constantly. Jim never really understood how draining it can be to always have someone wanting your attention, your affection, your time. Even when I'm at my own place, he's always texting or calling, wanting to know what I'm doing, if I want to hang out, if I'm free for dinner. It gets exhausting being needed that much. The sex thing became an issue pretty early on, though I don't think Jim ever realized it. He was always the one initiating everything, which honestly got old fast. I mean, I'm not some sex-crazed teenager who's going to throw myself at a man every time I see him. I have other things on my mind: work, family, my own interests. But Jim seemed to interpret my lack of constant sexual enthusiasm as some kind of personal rejection, when really it was just me being a normal adult woman with a life beyond the bedroom. When he'd ask me about things like self-pleasure or whether I ever wanted to try anything different, I'd always tell him the truth. I had no need for any of that stuff. Why would I? Our physical relationship was fine as it was, and I'm not someone who obsesses over sex like some people do. I think Jim wanted me to be more like those women you see in movies who are always hungry for it, but that's just not who I am. I'm more sophisticated than that. Work started getting really demanding about 6 months ago. I'm in marketing for a mid-sized firm, and we landed this huge client that required me to do a lot of presentations and extra research. The stress was incredible, and the last thing I wanted when I got home was Jim hovering around wanting to talk about his day or expecting me to be all lovey-dovey. When you're dealing with high-pressure situations at work, you need your personal time to decompress, not to perform emotional labor for your boyfriend. It was during one of my parent visits around that time that I met Antonio. He was doing some contracting work on my parents' neighbor's house, and we ended up talking one afternoon when I was getting the mail. Antonio was different from Jim in every possible way: confident, direct, funny, without trying too hard. When he asked for my number, I gave it to him without even thinking about it. There was something refreshing about talking to a man who didn't need constant reassurance or validation. Antonio and I started texting regularly, and I found myself looking forward to his messages in a way I hadn't felt in years. He was interesting, he had opinions about things, he made me laugh. When I was with Jim, conversations always felt like work. Him asking questions, me giving polite responses, him trying so hard to connect that it became awkward. With Antonio, everything flowed naturally. The first time Antonio and I hooked up, I felt like I was finally awake after years of sleepwalking. He knew exactly what he wanted and wasn't afraid to take it, which was such a relief after years of Jim's tentative, permission-asking approach to everything. Antonio made me feel desirable in a way I'd forgotten was possible. When he suggested we try some things to make our time together even better, I didn't hesitate to say yes. I'd never been in a sex shop before, but Antonio knew exactly what to look for. We got a couple of cock rings and some nipple suckers, and I have to admit, using them with Antonio was a revelation. This was what I'd been missing with Jim: actual passion, actual excitement, the feeling that sex could be an adventure instead of just another relationship obligation. Antonio knew how to use everything properly, knew how to make me feel things I didn't even know I could feel. After that first time with the toys, going back to Jim felt impossible. How was I supposed to get excited about his boring, vanilla approach when I knew what real intensity felt like? When Jim would try to initiate sex, all I could think about was how much better it was with Antonio. How much more alive I felt with someone who actually knew what he was doing. I started saying no to oral sex completely. I'd tried to be accommodating for years, but after experiencing what it was like with someone who actually made an effort, Jim's half-hearted attempts just felt insulting. When he'd ask why, I'd just say no and change the subject. I don't owe anyone an explanation for what I do or don't want to do with my own body. The regular sex became harder to tolerate, too. I'd find myself making excuses. I was too tired, I didn't feel like it, I had a headache, I was stressed about work. All of which were true, by the way. When you're dealing with a demanding job and a boyfriend who constantly needs attention, and then you have this amazing secret relationship that actually fulfills you, it becomes pretty obvious where you want to spend your energy. Jim started getting clingy around this time, calling more often when I was at my parents', sending long texts about missing me and wanting to talk. It was suffocating. I'd gotten used to the freedom of my arrangement with him, and suddenly he was trying to insert himself into every moment of my life. I started responding less frequently to his messages, keeping phone calls short, making it clear that I had other priorities. The work excuse became my go-to response for everything. I can't talk long. I have presentations to prepare. I'm exhausted from meetings all day. This project is consuming my life. All technically true, work was stressful, but it was also convenient that Jim never questioned it, never pushed back. He'd just accept whatever I told him and try to be understanding, which honestly made me respect him even less. 2 months ago, I basically stopped pretending to be the girlfriend he wanted. I was hardly calling him at all, barely responding to his texts, and when I was at my place and he wanted to spend time together, I'd usually claim I was too tired or too busy. The truth was, talking to Jim had become tedious. After spending time with Antonio, who was funny and confident and made me feel like an interesting person, going back to Jim's needy questions and boring conversation felt like a chore. Antonio and I had gotten into a routine by then. When I was visiting my parents, we'd spend almost every evening together. He'd come over after work, we'd have dinner, and then we'd use the toys and have the kind of sex that actually meant something. Antonio never asked me about my relationship status, never made things complicated with emotions or expectations. He understood that what we had was about pleasure and excitement, not some fairy tale romance. I'd gotten careless about hiding the evidence, I'll admit that. When you're living a double life for months and nothing bad happens, you start to feel invincible. I'd bring the toys back and forth between my place and my parents', keeping them in a small bag in my suitcase. Usually I was careful about putting everything away properly when I got home, but after my last visit with Antonio, I was distracted and exhausted. I'd had an incredible 3 weeks with Antonio. We'd tried some new things, spent more time together than usual, and I was already missing him before I'd even left my parents' place. When I got back to my own house, I was rushing to unpack and get ready for Jim to come over the next day. I must have grabbed the used cock ring from my bag and just tossed it in the bathroom drawer without thinking, assuming I'd deal with organizing everything later. Jim came over the next evening like always, acting like a puppy who hadn't seen his owner in weeks. He was asking about my trip, wanting to hear about everything I'd done, trying to reconnect in that desperate way he always did after I'd been away. I gave him the usual responses about spending time with my parents, helping them with house projects, relaxing and decompressing from work stress. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard him rummaging around in the bathroom. "Looking for dental floss," he called out, and I didn't think anything of it. Jim was always looking for something. He never remembered where I kept things in my house, even after 5 years. I was focused on cooking and thinking about some emails I needed to send for work the next day. When he came back to the kitchen, he seemed quiet, but Jim's always been moody, so I didn't pay attention. He ate dinner without saying much, which was actually a relief because I wasn't in the mood for his usual attempts at deep conversation. After dinner, he said he had to leave early for some work thing the next morning, and I was honestly glad to have the evening to myself. Over the next few days, Jim was acting weird. He'd call and then seem distracted during our conversations, like he wasn't really listening to my responses. When I'd tell him about my day or mention something about work, he'd just make these non-committal sounds instead of asking follow-up questions like he usually did. I figured he was going through some kind of midlife crisis thing. Men his age do that sometimes, getting all introspective and moody for no reason. The strangest part was how he started looking at me differently when we were together. Instead of his usual eager, puppy dog attention, he'd watch me with this calculating expression, like he was trying to figure something out. It was honestly annoying because I was dealing with my own stress at work, and the last thing I needed was Jim having some kind of emotional breakdown that he expected me to manage. I asked him a couple of times if something was wrong, but he'd just say he was fine and change the subject, which was typical Jim behavior, honestly. He never wanted to directly address problems, always hoping things would just work themselves out without any difficult conversations. I stopped asking because I had my own life to worry about, and if he wanted to be mysterious and moody, that was his choice. Work really was overwhelming during this period. I had 3 major presentations in 2 weeks, plus my regular client management responsibilities. I was staying late most nights, bringing projects home on weekends, barely having time to eat properly, let alone deal with relationship drama. When Jim would text asking if I wanted to hang out, I'd usually say I was too swamped with work to do anything social. The irony was that this was exactly when I needed Antonio the most. He was the only thing that could help me relax and forget about work stress, but I was stuck in the city dealing with Jim's weird mood and my demanding job. Antonio and I were texting constantly, and he kept saying he missed me and couldn't wait for my next visit. Having that to look forward to was the only thing getting me through those stressful weeks. I started planning my next trip to my parents earlier than usual. Normally, I'd wait the full 2 or 3 weeks before going back, but between work stress and Jim's strange behavior, I needed to get away. I told Jim I was leaving for my parents' place a few days early because my mom needed help with something, which wasn't technically true, but wasn't completely false either. My mom always had projects I could help with. The night before I was supposed to leave, Jim came over and asked if we could talk. The way he said it, all serious and formal, made me immediately defensive. I was tired from a long day at work, I still had packing to do, and the last thing I wanted was some heavy relationship conversation. But Jim seemed determined, so I figured I'd let him say whatever he needed to say, and then get on with my evening. "We need to talk about what I found in your bathroom," he said, and the second those words came out of his mouth, I knew exactly what this pathetic loser was talking about. Of course he went snooping around my private stuff. I always knew he was the type who'd eventually cross that line, even though he'd spent 5 years acting like some respectful saint. The way he was standing there all nervous and twitchy, like he was the one who should be upset about this situation, was honestly laughable. I stayed completely calm because that's just how I am under pressure. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, which wasn't really a lie since he hadn't been specific about what he'd found. Maybe he'd just seen the cock ring and didn't know what it was, or maybe he was bluffing to see how I'd react. Jim's not smart enough to be manipulative usually, but desperate people sometimes surprise you. "The cock ring, Daphne. The used cock ring in your bathroom drawer." His voice was shaking, which would have been pathetic if it wasn't so annoying. "And I found more stuff in your bedroom, toys that we've never used together." I was already 3 steps ahead, thinking about how I was going to flip this whole thing around on him. Really, what kind of man goes digging through his girlfriend's personal belongings? That's the real violation here. "So you went through my private things without permission," I said. "You violated my privacy, and now you want to interrogate me about what you found." 5 years, Daphne. 5 years I've been trying to make you happy, and you're cheating on me with someone else. Now he had tears in his eyes. Actual tears, like we were in some soap opera. It was honestly embarrassing, watching a grown man fall apart like this. I never promised you monogamy, I said, which was true. We'd never had that conversation explicitly. And I'm not the type of person who makes assumptions about relationship boundaries. You assumed we were exclusive, but we never actually agreed to that. The look on his face was priceless, like I'd slapped him or something. We've been together for 5 years. We've been in a relationship. We've been dating, I corrected him. We don't live together. We don't share finances. We've never talked about marriage or a future together. You've been content with this arrangement for 5 years, so don't suddenly act like we had some kind of deeper commitment. Jim was pacing around my living room now, running his hands through his hair like some kind of crazy person. The toys, Daphne. You told me you had no interest in that stuff. You said you didn't need any of that. I don't need it with you, I said, because honestly, that was the truth. With Jim, sex was just another relationship obligation, something to check off the list to keep him satisfied. With Antonio, it was actually exciting, worth putting effort into. Different relationships serve different purposes. Who is he? Jim's voice was getting louder, which was making me angry, because I don't like being yelled at in my own home. How long has this been going on? That's not your business, I said. What I do when I'm not with you is my private life. When you're visiting your parents. It wasn't a question. All those trips to your parents, you've been fucking someone else. The crude language was so unlike Jim that it actually surprised me. Usually, he was all polite and respectful, never talking about sex directly. But I guess discovering your girlfriend's secret life can change a person's vocabulary. My relationship with Antonio has nothing to do with you, I said, and immediately regretted using his name. But it was too late now, and honestly, I was tired of pretending. He gives me something you can't give me. What? What does he give you that I can't? The question was so pathetic I almost laughed. Passion, excitement. He knows how to make me feel like a woman, instead of just going through the motions because it's expected. Jim sat down heavily on my couch, putting his head in his hands. I thought we were happy. I thought you were satisfied with our relationship. You thought what you wanted to think, I said. You never asked me if I was happy. You just assumed that because I didn't complain, everything was perfect. You stopped wanting to have sex with me. You stopped calling, stopped texting back. I thought you were just stressed about work. I was stressed about work, but I was also getting my needs met elsewhere, so I didn't need to rely on you for everything anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. Jim just sat there staring at me like he'd never seen me before, and I stood there waiting for him to either leave or say something productive. This whole conversation was exactly why I'd avoided it for so long. It was messy and emotional and completely unnecessary. Do you love him? Jim finally asked. Love is a complicated word, I said. I enjoy spending time with him. He makes me feel good about myself. He doesn't expect me to be someone I'm not. And I do? You expect me to be grateful for mediocre sex and boring conversation. You expect me to prioritize your feelings over my own needs. You expect me to be satisfied with a relationship that doesn't challenge me or excite me. Jim stood up slowly, like he was moving through water. I need you to choose, him or me. The audacity of that demand actually made me laugh. You don't get to give me ultimatums, Jim. That's not how this works. Then I'm choosing for both of us, he said. We're done. Fine, I said, because really, what else was I supposed to say? If Jim couldn't handle the reality of our relationship, that was his problem. I wasn't going to beg him to stay or promise to change who I was just to accommodate his insecurities. He walked toward the door, then turned back. I really loved you, Daphne. I would have done anything for you. I know, I said, because that was the problem. Jim's love was suffocating and needy, and based on this fantasy version of me that didn't exist. Antonio's approach was so much healthier. He wanted me for who I actually was, not who he needed me to be. After Jim left, I felt relieved more than anything else. No more pretending to be interested in his boring stories, no more managing his emotions, no more guilt about not being the girlfriend he wanted. I could finally be honest about what I wanted and who I was seeing. I called Antonio that night, and told him what had happened. He was supportive without being dramatic about it, which was exactly what I needed. "Sounds like it was time for that conversation anyway," he said. "Now, you don't have to sneak around anymore." But over the next few weeks, things with Antonio started changing too. Without the excitement of our secret relationship, the dynamic between us shifted. He started expecting me to be available more often, started talking about me spending more time in my parents' town, started making comments about my job and my life in the city. The sex was still good, but Antonio began making demands that felt uncomfortably similar to Jim's neediness. He wanted to know why I couldn't stay longer during my visits, why I needed to go back to the city so often, whether I was seeing anyone else. The freedom and excitement that had drawn me to him in the first place was disappearing, replaced by the same kind of possessive expectations I'd just escaped. When I tried to explain that I needed to maintain my independence, that I wasn't ready to completely uproot my life for any relationship, Antonio got defensive. "I thought this meant something to you," he said. "I thought you chose me." "I chose honesty," I said. "I chose not living a lie anymore." But Antonio wasn't satisfied with that answer, and our conversation started feeling like work again. The passionate, no-strings-attached relationship I'd valued was turning into another set of obligations and expectations. Within a month of Jim and me breaking up, Antonio and I were having the same kinds of arguments about time and commitment and what I owed him emotionally. I ended things with Antonio after 6 weeks of increasing pressure and drama. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd left one demanding relationship only to watch another one turn into the same thing. But at least I'd learned something valuable about myself and what I actually wanted. Now I'm single for the first time in years, and honestly, it's exactly what I needed. No one texting me constantly, no one expecting me to account for my time, no one making demands on my emotional energy. I can focus on work, spend time with my parents without any ulterior motives, and figure out what I actually want from life without having to consider someone else's feelings constantly. Sometimes I wonder if Jim has learned anything from our relationship, if he's figured out how to be less needy and more confident with the next woman he dates. Probably not. People like Jim rarely change. They just find someone else who's willing to enable their emotional dependence. As for me, I'm in no hurry to get involved with anyone else. I've spent enough time managing other people's expectations and trying to be someone I'm not. For now, I'm perfectly content being alone, being honest, and not apologizing for knowing what I want and going after it.